You know, even non-fans have to acknowledge The Daily Show became a cultural touchstone as well as a place to go for some laughs. Now, we get into that and more in part 2 of my conversation with the author of the new book, Chris Smith. I'm curious, Chris, from his perspective and those that worked on the show the longest, what they found to be the proudest accomplishments. For me, and again, just as a viewer, it was always the times where they'd play clips and then they'd play the following clip and you'd hear the ooh from the audience like, oh, wow. I remember with Bush Sr. and Jr. competing sound bites in terms of their view of Iraq, et cetera. But there were so many others where you'd hear it and you'd realize the lunacy of the official who was trying to convince you of something when the facts, or his own words more often than not, said 180 degrees from that. Was that for them too?
Sure. I mean, they were very proud that they essentially pioneered that approach. The piece I think you're referring to was 2003 during the war, where they contrasted. It was actually Bush Jr., Bush W. with himself, governor, campaigner, candidate versus president, and saying things diametrically opposed. And we've covered plenty of politicians, not a shock that they lie or change their point of view along the way. But The Daily Show, making those contrasts, was a pioneering effort. I mean, proudest moments, one of the things, particularly for Jon personally, and he said the show didn't try to have impact in a political, vote for this guy, vote for that guy kind of way. But one of the things it did try to highlight was absurdity, the failure of common sense in government, and that was starkest in the Zadroga Act, that in 2015 was up for renewal. Republicans were refusing to fund it, after demagoguing 9/11 and firefighters whenever it was useful.
And just as a reminder to our audience, this was the health care for the rescue workers that were there that had gone.
Exactly.
And real numbers of people died in the aftermath because of the toxic dust. But I'm sorry to interrupt.
Still are.
Yep.
Still are, yeah. And, those firefighters and first responders have done 15 years worth of legwork in the halls of Congress, lobbying for the funding, but it wasn't going to happen. And Jon did a piece, a really emotional, dramatic piece in the late stages of the debate in Congress, even after Jon had left the show, and I go into great detail about that in the book, that essentially shamed a lot of senators into getting on board with making the funding for first responders permanent. So for Jon personally, yes, he gives a great deal of credit to a guy named John Field, who was a heavy equipment operator who lost part of his foot in the Ground Zero response. Jon Field has done a tremendous amount over the years to make this happen. But Jon Stewart came in at the last moment and gave it the kind of attention that was necessary. Yeah,
Field's a very good friend to the program, and he said that early on, before it became popular, Stewart was on that issue. Give an idea I was going through some of the names here, and while some people obviously know the Colberts or the Carells, there's a ton of people, even prominent actors or actresses, from the Ed Helms to the Olivia Munns to the Riggles to people even in major producers now. The amount of careers this show launched or at least accelerated is unbelievable.
It is. Jon and his producers over the years, tremendous eye for talent. That got easier to some extent as The Daily Show became more popular. They were attracting a lot of talented folks. And you make a good point, too, like Sam Bee, the woman who's the executive producer of Sam Bee's Full Frontal, came up through the ranks, was hired for the first time as a writer on The Daily Show. Larry Wilmore is now doing a new thing on ABC. And that was one of the more painful episodes and evolutions of the show, which Jon and other folks talk in great detail about in the book, is it started out as a very white male bunch on camera and behind the camera. And Jon, over the years, took a lot of heat for that and wised up, opened up, learned through a lot of painful episodes and criticism how diversity could really be good for the show. You saw people like Wilmore, Wyatt Cenac, Jessica Williams, another huge talent. He really elevated and empowered a lot of women over the years.
What's his thoughts, as best you can get the real thoughts, on Trevor Noah as a successor? And he didn't pick who would take over for him. How do people feel, especially given what happened to Wiltmore?
Yeah, Jon loves Trevor. You talk about his eye for talent. 3-4 years ago, Jon saw about 15 seconds of Trevor's stand-up routine on David Letterman and said, that guy could do my job. And he's right, and he's very proud of where Trevor's taken the show. I think Trevor did a tremendous interview with this woman whose name I'm going to mispronounce. Her name's Tomi Lahren or something, who's become sort of this, caricatured, racist Barbie is what she's called online. And Trevor did a really tough interview with her that people are starting to call Trevor Noah's Jon Stewart moment.
And finally, Chris, for me, what would have been, I said to some people, the absence of Tim Russert, for example, in the last election season, just because nobody still in my eyes has ever still mastered the quote. Putting somebody there, bringing up the full screen and having them respond or have to explain it with that level of research. I think he was missed, and I don't think that role was replicated. I know different time and all the rest, but still. Conversely, Jon Stewart, I thought, especially if you look at the millennial vote and how it went, if he chose to, and I would think he would if he had been doing the show for the last year, if he had chose to articulate that it really isn't just lesser of two evils, there may have been a different result, maybe more of a passionate turnout, or maybe less of, I don't know what would have happened. What do you think down deep he believed that if he was there may or may not have been different on that Tuesday in November?
I know for a fact, for having talked to him, he thinks nothing would be different. Do
you buy that,
he hasn't
though?
Gone through. I do, and I think he's right. I mean, that if you go through and look at the swing states, the vote where Trump won, in the electoral college terms were important, not necessarily hotbeds of Jon Stewart Daily Show fans. It's an interesting what if. It might have changed the tenor of the media coverage of Trump earlier on. That's the thing I think might have been different. But, you got to remember also, Hillary got more votes, so there were a lot of people who stereotypically would be in the Daily Show Jon Stewart camp who came out and voted, where they voted. That's obviously what made a difference. There's a generation of citizens, voters, who grew up watching The Daily Show, have had their view of politics and the media, shaped by The Daily Show, and look at the world and deconstruct things through that lens. Was it decisive this time? I guess not. But the other thing that it's interesting to me is there's also a generation of reporters, many of whom did a really great job in this campaign, who grew up watching Daily Show clips, being fans of Jon Stewart, good reporters on their own. He's not teaching them the doctrine of Jon exactly. But I think the quickness to call Trump on lies that you saw, particularly in print media, I mean, those are people who've been shaped by growing up in the Jon Stewart era.
Well, even if you're a casual fan of the show, or even to just like to know how it gets all put together, and let alone somebody who had a major cultural impact, the book again, The Daily Show, and Chris Smith.
And I promise there's a lot of funny stuff in it.
Oh, very funny stuff. I'm sorry, no. Very funny stuff here,
it's me.
Funny road trips and all the rest that are in here too, with a lot of funny people, obviously, doing a lot of the talking. Chris, I appreciate the time, and again, great job. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, everyone, we'll take a look at some local headlines. Please stay with us.